Okay, in summary, the digestive activities in the mouth include structures and what they do. So this is a good summary slide, but you'll see that you have cheeks and lips, obviously, and they're there to keep food in between the teeth. We don't need food sitting out on each side of your teeth. We need to keep it in between the teeth so we can masticate, we can chew that food. Salivary glands, we looked at saliva and what's in saliva. And the function collectively of that saliva is to moisten and lubricate, but also start to digest carbohydrates, also known as starch, into smaller carbohydrates. Your tongue, we didn't talk too much about it, but your tongue is a muscle. It's got a number of muscles, muscles that insert into it that move it around to kind of shape our food into what's called a bolus. The bolus is what you're going to eventually swallow. There are some intrinsic muscles that kind of alter its shape. Taste buds, you've learned about your sense of taste in A&P1 or gustation. Finally, teeth. And we learned about the different types of teeth and how many teeth we have. Okay, let's move on and swallow. So these two pictures show the process of deglutition, or swallowing. And you'll notice here is the mass of food that we've mixed saliva in. We've shaped it into what's known as the bolus. And the first phase of swallowing is voluntary. We call it the voluntary stage or phase of swallowing. It requires skeletal muscles of your throat, and that's going to move that bolus into the oropharynx. Remember, the oropharynx is this part of your throat. You'll notice when we move that bolus into the oropharynx, the epiglottis is going to close off that respiratory tract. So in this second phase here, the pharyngeal phase, the epiglottis closes down, and that bolus is going to slide into that esophagus, which is located posterior to the respiratory tract. And during that process, you'll notice that breathing is going to be interrupted because we have to close off that respiratory tract while that bolus travels back into the epiglottis, into the esophagus. Then that bolus is going to move by a process called peristalsis. Peristalsis is using the circular muscles to squeeze and the longitudinal muscles to push. So this squeezing and pushing effect is going to move that bolus down to the stomach. In order for it to enter the stomach, there needs to be relaxation of a sphincter muscle. There's a sphincter muscle located in between the esophagus and the stomach. It's known as the lower esophageal sphincter, or LES. Sometimes it's called the cardiac sphincter because your heart is located very close. Your heart's going to be located right about here in the thoracic cavity. This esophagus has to go through the diaphragm in order to reach that stomach. That lower esophageal sphincter can cause some problems. If it doesn't relax, guess what? That bolus is going to be sitting there, and it causes kind of a distension of that esophagus, which can cause a little bit of chest pain. Or it doesn't close back up after the bolus enters. If it doesn't close back up, you could have stomach acid leaking up into this esophagus, which also would cause chest pain. We call heartburn. So that lower esophageal sphincter has been known to cause some problems in certain individuals. Summary of digestive activities in your throat and esophagus. So the pharynx or throat is involved in swallowing the bolus, moving that bolus from the oral cavity into the oropharynx, to the laryngopharynx, and then finally into that esophagus. The esophagus is going to move the bolus using peristalsis until it enters the stomach. You'll notice the only thing that is produced by the throat and esophagus is mucus. So the throat or esophagus doesn't produce any digestive enzymes that are going to digest. It's just going to secrete some mucus to help lubricate the lining. Here's a drawing of the stomach. We notice that, again, the esophagus coming down. Right about here would be that location of the lower esophageal sphincter. This drawing divides this stomach up into different regions. The cardia is this area here where the bolus is going to enter first. Cardia in reference to the heart, because the heart is located right about here in the chest. This upper rounded portion is known as the fundus of the stomach. The definition of a fundus is actually furthest from the opening. Here's the opening. That's where food is, going to leave the stomach. So that furthest part of the stomach, that's upper rounded part, is known as the fundus. This whole area would be called the body of the stomach. And then towards that small intestine, that duodenum, is the pyloric region. The pyloric antrum and the pyloric canal. I typically just call this whole area here the pylorus, but really the pylorus is just this part right before the food will enter the duodenum. And there's a sphincter located there as well, known as the pyloric sphincter. That sphincter is going to be closed to keep the food in the stomach, but slowly relax to release small amounts. So one major function of your stomach is to kind of slow this whole process down and store a lot of this material in the stomach to give your small intestine more time to work on the material. Your small intestine is going to be the area that does most of the digestion and most of the absorption. So you want it to take its time. So the stomach really slows things up. What else can you see? You can see there's 3 layers of muscle. There's a circular layer, there's a longitudinal layer, and now there's an additional oblique layer. That allows this stomach to really churn the material, really mix that material. There's a couple curvatures, lesser curvature, greater curvature. But if you look on the inside surface, there are these folds. These large folds in the stomach are called rugae. And that allows that stomach to unfold to accommodate large amounts of food. But then if the stomach is empty, it kind of folds in. And that makes that stomach much smaller. So the stomach doesn't really stretch a whole lot every time it fills. It more unfolds. It unfolds and then kind of folds in when it's empty. So that's the anatomy of the stomach. The function of the stomach. So here's just a list from your book talking about the 4 major functions. First one is mixing. So it really mixes. It mixes that saliva, food, and gastric juice together to form a liquefied material known as chyme. So if you recall, there's a bolus that enters, but then the material that leaves the stomach is known as chyme. It's much more liquid than the bolus. It serves as a reservoir, so it kind of holds up the process and then slowly releases chyme into the small intestine. It does quite a bit of secretion, so it's going to add in what we call gastric juice. That's everything that the stomach secretes. It's going to have a lot of acid, hydrochloric acid. That hydrochloric acid does two major functions. It's going to kill a lot of things because of that acidity. It also helps to denature protein. Denaturing a protein is unfolding that protein, making it easier to break the bonds in between the amino acids. Proteins are typically all folded up. So in order to digest them, you have to unfold them, and we call that process denaturation. We add in an enzyme. The enzyme that's going to digest protein is called pepsin. So pepsin breaks down proteins into amino acids. We add in another molecule called intrinsic factor, which is going to help absorb B12. And we add in another lipase, which is going to help digest triglycerides. Fourth function here is production of a hormone called gastrin. We're going to pick up on the stomach on the next video.